Okay. Good morning and welcome everyone to the Wilson Center. The Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars was established by Congress as a living memorial to President Wilson. And I like that, no statue, an actual living, working, breathing entity that is reaching out and dedicated to bringing together independent research, open dialogue, and coming up with actionable ideas. That's what we're aiming for today. And we are delighted to have with us our colleagues from the UK's Royal United Services Institute, which is the world's oldest think tank and also the UK's leading defense and security think tank. Many of you in this room will be familiar with RUSI's work on a whole wide range of issues. Their mission is to inform and to influence and enhance public debate to build a safer and more stable world. The research that we are here to discuss today could not be a better illustration of that mission. RUSI's report, Silicon Lifeline, is an in-depth look at how Russia's use of Western electronics is powering the war in Ukraine today. It underscores Russia's dependence on these components and how it is scrambling to replace them as it loses equipment to Ukrainian forces. Their work is not only informative and timely, it gives us a foundation for future action. And from my perspective, it also reads like a thriller. So those of you that have not had a chance to look at this yet, it includes a very vibrant interactive component to it. It is worth your time. And I think we will have a fascinating discussion today. We are lucky to have several of the report's authors with us. And so I'm going to introduce them running left from my right to left. So James Byrne is the director of the Open Source Intelligence and Analysis at RUSI. His research is focused on North Korea's illicit shipping and procurement networks, as well as Russia's activity in the High North. Gary Somerville is a research fellow also working on open source intelligence and analysis at RUSI. He is a specialist in using open source methodology to track sanctions evasion activities. And Dr. Jack Watling is Senior Research Fellow for Land Warfare at RUSI, and we are very proud to add, a Global Fellow at the Wilson Center. He works closely with the British military on concepts of operations and conducts operational analysis of contemporary conflicts. His background as a journalist gives him a keen sense for how to present research in a way that makes it news we can use. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to James and ask you to lead us through some of the findings of your research. Okay? And I think that we should be queued up for the PowerPoint presentation. Okay? So if I can ask our audiovisual team to start that presentation.
Right, let's have a look. Yeah, there we go.
Good.
So thank you very much for having us here today. It really is a huge honor. We love coming to DC, we love coming to the States. It's always just such an engaged audience, both in the sort of non-governmental sector, but also in the government here. We've been here for a few days. We've given a range of presentations on a number of things. Some of it's related to this work, some of it's related to our other work. But being here today is just, it's just a great opportunity to sit down and work through some of these findings. This is quite a special piece of work for us because it's involved really the marrying of a lot of things that we've developed over the years working on North Korea and China, which is sort of like open source intelligence, the collection, the processing of documents, like network analysis, ship tracking, et cetera, with marrying it with the military sciences team and actually work on the ground in Ukraine looking at these weapon systems. And so that's really at the heart of this piece, and I think it's what made it a very, very powerful piece of research. It wasn't just the cataloging of all of this stuff on the ground. It was then trying to trace it back and work through these supply chains, look at the technology, and try and tell a story about what the Russians have been doing, how they've been getting these components, how they've been using them, and really what that means for us. So the report is titled Silicon Lifeline. We released it in August. We've just released another one called the All-Land Complex. And we're going to talk through some of those things whilst we do it. And I'm going to bring in Gary and Jack, who probably really should be the stars of the show. So there's a disclaimer here. So we're in a public place, so I'll put the disclaimer up quickly, and then we'll go through. So this is RUSI. It's on Whitehall. I'm actually very pleased to say I've already met a member of RUSI, a US member of RUSI, in the audience. I hope there are more, but if not, please come and visit and join. When the war started, very quickly after the war started, I'm going to hand over to Jack. Jack and the team actually were over there. And one of the things that they started to see very, very early on was just a huge range of Russian equipment. Obviously, the war didn't go very well for them. And the Ukrainians managed to collect just huge volumes of equipment. The report that we did at the start, really it was the start of the war, only processed equipment that was captured very early on, right? So it was only equipment that we focused on. That really was the end of May, I think, when we had the cutoff date. In reality, we have just a huge volume of data after May to now that we haven't processed. And so methodologically, there's sort of like an observational selection effect in the sense that, you know, we only saw equipment, we only processed equipment in that report which was captured at the start. And a lot of that stuff that was used was legacy equipment. It was old Russian missiles, some of it new. But Jack, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of this stuff, and then I'll go through on to the next slide.
Sure. So Nick Reynolds and I had been working with the Ukrainian military before the conflict started. We ended up getting pulled out of Ukraine a few days before it kicked off by the British military. And at that point, everyone was very pessimistic. We weren't sure whether we would see our colleagues again. So it was really a relief to go back into Ukraine in April when things were still fairly sketchy. We didn't know what the trajectory of the conflict was. And it was our first day back in Ukraine. And that evening there was an airstrike, or rather that morning, early morning, there was an airstrike. A series of missiles came in, air raid sirens going off, which kind of set the tone for the fact that that was happening 3 times a day at that point. After breakfast that morning, a Ukrainian general officer walked into the room with a bag, and he pulled out of that bag a computer, a large metal box which opened up with a series of chipboards in it, which turned out to be the ballistic missile computer for the 9M727 that you see there. And as he went through the layers of chipboards, he started pointing out all of the chips that were manufactured in the United States, which was a very significant proportion of them. Grabbed my interest. I asked, how much else do you have like this? And he said, well, actually, we've got whole dumps of stuff that people are depositing equipment in, and we're going through it slowly. And we're finding this across everything. And so Nick and I started to work with the Ukrainians to systematically catalog all of the foreign components that we could find. And it didn't matter whether you were looking at the most advanced and latest Russian signals intelligence stations, or the special forces communications radios that they were using to avoid electronic warfare and to avoid detection, or the encryption systems that they were using, or the guidance systems for their long-range missiles, both ballistic and cruise missiles, or the radar for their air defense systems that, as a military analyst, I had spent weeks trying to work out how to defeat these systems, only to realize that actually critical components in them were not just Western-made, but in many cases export control components that we have been trying to prevent getting into Russia. They weren't just old components. They were often very, very recent as 2021 at that point. And when I was back in Kyiv in October, first thing we saw when we reached Kyiv was a wave of Shahed 136 Iranian-made UAVs come over and strike just in front of us. And a day later, I was with the same Ukrainian general officer pulling apart one of those Shaheds that didn't explode. And of course, what did we find in that Iranian-made weapon system? But again, a large number of export-controlled critical electronics manufactured mainly in the United States and across Europe. And so that has been the genesis of this work, is the fact that we actually have the physical objects. There is another aspect to this, which is that at the same time we're gathering a lot of information from inside Russia. And it is very evident, and was evident back in April, that the Russians have a massive infrastructure for gathering this stuff. A lot of our sanctions processes have been around attacking companies, but the infrastructure is fundamentally built around people, not companies. It's been built for a very long time, it's been operating for a very long time, and we are doing far less to degrade that infrastructure. So when we came out of Ukraine, we handed this data over to OSIA and said, what can you transform this closed source material essentially into in terms of stacking it in open sources so that we can discuss this publicly? And that's what James and his team set about doing, Gary and a number of others. So I will hand back over to explain how that worked.
Yeah, one second. Thank you, Jack. So if you see on the slide here, what I mentioned at the start was these 27 weapons platforms was the first data set that we worked on. And you can see, as Jack said up there, it was all sorts of things. It was long-range strike assets. It was relatively new KH-101 cruise missiles. It was sort of legacy missiles that had been manufactured in the early 90s, secret communication systems, just a huge range of things. They all contained, everything that we saw contained Western manufactured components, microelectronics. But we focused on that in the report, the microelectronics aspect, the semiconductor aspect. But it isn't just that. It isn't just that that's in the Russian systems. There's sophisticated hydraulics made in our countries. There are engines. There's all sorts of different bits of pieces of kit that are originally manufactured in our countries and then exported, smuggled, however they got there to Russia to use in these weapons platforms. Now, the story focused on the microelectronics, right? Because the Russians can't build these weapons platforms without those microelectronics, right? They are like a key part of the systems, right? They are a key part of modern weapon systems. Now, they've built them into all of these systems. What it does is obviously it allows them to create them, it allows them to create modern weapons, but it also introduces a critical vulnerability into their systems, right? Which is we have control over some of the ultimate technology in their supply chains. And that's something that I think is really worth highlighting and thinking about. A lot of people, when we talk about this, it's understood as an export control problem, as a problem, right? As, it's terrible that all of this stuff is getting there. But it's also an opportunity. It's also an opportunity because all of these systems are designed around these components. There's been a huge amount of research by the Russians for decades to build these modern weapons platforms. So it's not just a problem that we have, which is true, but it's also an opportunity for us to be able to interdict these supply chains, to be able to cause problems for the Russians, the ability to essentially slow down their rearmament. And that is exactly what they're trying to do now. And it's rearmament at scale. They need to procure these things at a huge scale because they've lost so much equipment. So, Gary, why don't you talk a little bit about where some of these things came from?
Sure thing. So, once we got the data set handed over from Jack, that was provided to us by the Ukrainians and that. So in terms of how we arranged this, we took the data, we translated it from the Ukrainian into the English, and then went through all the serial numbers on the component names to try to verify them, that they were actually produced by the companies that the Ukrainians said they were produced. So we had a large spreadsheet of the components, the designation, whether or not we've actually managed to find them on the company websites or through, like, say, third-party distributors such as like Mouser or Arrow Electronics, and then sort of match them up with the sort of weapon systems that they were found in as well. And then once we did that, we then also looked at essentially whether or not any of these components were subject to particularly US export controls, whether or not they had an ECCN, an export control classification number. And of that, though, so in terms of that, we found in total 450 unique microelectronic components amongst those 27 weapon systems, of which at least 81 had an ECCN and therefore were subject to export control from the United States. And we also categorized the components by the country of origin, by the company that designed the chips and that. And we found that the vast majority, unsurprisingly, came from the United States, at least 318 of them. And we went and we had a look through like who the manufacturers are, and some of the largest manufacturers of these components were Analog Devices and Texas Instruments, who, major multinational microelectronics companies that are also supplying the US military and probably other militaries as well of allied countries to the US with sophisticated microelectronics for use in their own defense platforms and weapons platforms as well. But it wasn't just the US as well. We also found that throughout a number of components also came from a number of sort of partner countries of the United States as well, including Japan, which, for example, had a number of capacitors produced by a company called Murata Electronics, oscillators produced by a particularly sort of small boutique UK company, as well as, for example, pressure sensors as well that were found in a number of the Russian UAVs produced by a Dutch company called NXP. And so it's not just the majority came from the US, but it was not just the US companies that had been targeted for the acquisition of these items for use in Russian weapon systems as well. So, that's something to keep in mind. So this is not just an issue for the US, but also for all, for Europe and also for a number of allied countries in East Asia as well. And when we were looking at this, we thought, we were actually quite surprised whether or not that we found this many sort of foreign microelectronics in weapon systems. But when we actually look into the history in terms of how the Russian intelligence services are actually operating and the measures they've gone through, like going back to, say, the 1940s, 1950s, where the Soviet intelligence agencies sought out foreign components, foreign technologies in order to try to accelerate the development of their own military, and that we actually came to the conclusion that actually this is not necessarily that surprising though. So the Soviets have been doing this for a very long time. There was the Directorate T under the KGB that was tasked specifically to do this as well, and they're actually quite successful. For example, they had a spy actually within the Texas Instruments office in France, I believe, in the 1960s, for example. And but in terms of the actual ongoing research, like in terms of what's happening now with the actual procurement of these microelectronics that have continued going into Russia, even like prior to the invasion, even after the invasion, there we've actually identified a number of commonalities of these procurement networks, most notably the use of transshipment hubs to try to circumvent a number of these export controls and sanctions that were already in place prior to the invasion and now much more stringent following that. And so in terms of, for example, in terms of our investigations, as you'll see in a couple of slides' time, and that these transshipment hubs are very critical to Russia acquiring these microelectronics.
Yeah. So just to add, I think over the course of this research, we found a huge volume of these things in the Russian weapons platforms. None of them, almost certainly none of them move directly from these manufacturers to the Russian companies. It just doesn't really happen, right? The Russians, as Gary said, have built up a really sophisticated infrastructure over the years. Intelligence agents in a range of places, people who work on their behalf, and they rely on just a load of essentially distributors and companies that sell these. So a lot of the stuff is moving from our countries to certain places, and then it's being transshipped basically to the Russians. Hong Kong is like a key transshipment hub, but it happens in other places as well. It happens. Turkey's become a big transshipment hub since then, and we can skip that slide. We talked about it, and I think. After we published this piece, I think what's also worth remembering, and I think Jack alluded to it at the very start, we published the piece with the data that we'd processed, that we'd had the time to process. And a lot of people since then have said, well, a lot of the components in these weapons platforms are very old, and they were moved to Russia a long time ago. And of course, to some degree, that's true, right? So in the report, we put the missile, which was 9M727 that Jack mentioned at the very start, that had these chipboards and the computers, originally manufactured probably in the early 90s with chips from 89, 90, stuff like that. But this is a caliber, and the chips in that were very recent chips. So it isn't just a historical problem, it is a contemporary problem. It's happening right now. It isn't just the fact that these chips were moved over there a long time ago, so we don't need to worry about it. It's happening today. And the research that we did recently, the second piece called the Orlan Complex, show that it's happening today. How it's done, right? We know how it's done. It's often done, especially when these are export control goods, especially when this is high technology, when it's important technology. It's done by, a lot of the time, Russian intelligence networks. So after the invasion, the very start of the invasion, the US Treasury sanctioned one company, for example, a range of individuals and companies who are operating out of Malta, using UK companies in a range of jurisdictions to move export-controlled and sensitive technology to the Russians. The US Treasury alleged they were working on behalf of the Russian intelligence agencies. We had a recent indictment as well in the United States where there was allegedly a Russian intelligence agent living in the country. It was a key node in a procurement network. They were buying export control technology. They were shipping it to their address. They were repackaging it. And then they were sending it on through Europe to ultimately Russia. So that is how they do it, right? So a lot of stuff is bought in these weapons platforms. It's maybe commercial, off-the-shelf stuff. It's easy to get. But the sensitive stuff doesn't move that way. A lot of the sensitive stuff is originally exported from our countries. And there's subterfuge involved. There's clandestine activities. And there's the smuggling involved. And I think part of this speaks to, and maybe we'll speak about it later on, but part of this speaks to, what Jack is saying earlier. It isn't just an export control problem. It's also, it should be seen partly as a sort of counterintelligence problem.
Absolutely. The Russians don't have an infinite number of people who know how to run these networks. And also, when they recruit agents, a lot of people think that this is an easy buck, right? If you're a Turkish businessman and the Russians come and say they're going to pay over the odds for something, then you might be prepared to forge some paperwork or play loose with the facts about the fact that you're re-exporting. But if the threat that those individuals who are quite happy to be agents of the Russian services for quick buck find that there is legal jeopardy involved, significant legal jeopardy, then they will find that there are far fewer people prepared to fulfill that role. The price goes up. And so actively tracking the actually relatively limited number of people who run these operations, keeping on top of the companies they are setting up every day, and they do set up dozens of companies every day, but it's the same people, allows you to keep on top of them and build up the pressure. And I'd just very briefly flag why this is a fight that's absolutely worthwhile. A lot of pushback we get is, well, they're always going to find a way, it's always going to get through. It may do. But if we look at the Iskander ballistic missile, 9M723, for example, the Russians entered the conflict with about 900 of them. They have just over 100 left. So they've used up a very significant proportion of their stockpile, some of which they need to keep for certain contingencies. And so for their long-range strikes on critical national infrastructure across Ukraine, which they use those missiles for now, they can currently produce 6 a month. Now, inside that missile are a number of computers, which are critical components to a number of different Russian weapon systems, common throughout them. And so there are actually a relatively small number of chips that have to be in all of those weapons. And if you can not necessarily prevent them getting chips, but just slow down or add friction into it getting there, you will slow down production. If you can prevent them from getting access to those chips, even if it's one chip on one chipboard in one of those critical computers, they have to redesign the computer. And most of the assessments that I've seen show that it takes them about 3 months once they found a solution to use a different chip to redesign it and spin production back up. Now, what does that mean? It means 18 fewer missiles hitting Ukraine. And so there is a direct correlation to the friction you can add into this process and saving lives. That is very, very clear, because the rate of usage, the demand for these things, means that they are having to produce new weapons.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. And I think that takes us on to, you want to talk a little bit about what's been happening recently. So that was the piece of work we published in August. It looked a lot of the cruise missiles, a range of the weapons platforms. But after that, what we wanted to do is look very closely at the supply chains for a particular piece of kit. And that piece of kit is the Orlan 10. I said this already in DC over the past few days. A lot of people laughed at the Orlan 10 at the start of the invasion because, it was taken apart and it had a Canon camera in it, right? Or it had a plastic fuel bottle for the fuel tank. But the Orlan 10 isn't a joke. It's actually a very, very sophisticated piece of kit, and it's a very dangerous piece of kit. I'm going to get Jack to explain a bit about it, because obviously he's been on the ground and he's seen these being used. But the Orlan 10 it's a sophisticated piece of kit. It's made by a Russian company called the Special Technology Center, which employs a range of very, very intelligent scientists that have been working on this stuff for a long time. It has a range of different possible payloads, right? So it can fit a range of different payloads: SIGINT payloads, electro-optical, infrared. electronic warfare. It can be used in combination effects, but it's an artillery. It's basically used to spot artillery, isn't it, Jack? Can you tell us a little bit about it, because you've seen it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Russians fly them from their artillery units out to find targets, whether that's through electronic detection or electro-optical detection. And the difference that that weapon system or those eyes make is that rather than being about 20 minutes in getting fires onto a target, which gives the target plenty of time to move away, if there's an all-antenna over a target, the Russians will not only hit it, but keep hitting it as it moves within about 3 to 5 minutes. And so it massively increases the responsiveness and the accuracy of Russian artillery, which is the main Russian weapon system. It's responsible for the vast majority of Ukrainian casualties throughout the conflict. It's also really difficult to counter because it's fairly resilient to electronic warfare. It flies too high to be engaged by more ubiquitous air defense systems like manpads. And it's actually quite cheap. It's crude and it uses a lot of commercial components, and therefore it's not economical or easy to engage with dedicated air defense systems like SA-8 or Buk or S-300. That would be really uneconomical to use those missiles against Orlans, which are maybe $80,000 to $120,000 each, depending on what the payload is. So this is a very, very effective, ubiquitous enabler that makes the Russian military drastically more lethal, and therefore a system that is worth disrupting and preventing them from getting more of.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the reasons why we focused on this piece of kit. It has a very interesting story behind it, the manufacturer. It has a very interesting story in terms of what's inside it. If you look into this graphic here, these are the components essentially extracted from all antennas. What did we find inside it? Well, it's a lot of the same stuff. It's a lot of components from our countries, from the United States, from Holland, from a range of places. Some of these are export controlled. Some of these are just commercial off-the-shelf electronics, but they are key to what the all-antenna is. They're the key to essentially how the piece of kit operates. And so that's why we are looking at it. There is a sophisticated supply chain behind it. They have a number of companies, essentially front companies, that the manufacturer uses to procure these. Now, what was really shocking was I'm going to go over to the graph and then come back, is what was really shocking when we did this is when we started to look at this piece of kit and we found the front company, we think, that procures the components for the manufacture of it, it's a Russian company, is that when we looked at the supply chains, in the run-up to the war and since the war started, they had massively increased their imports of components from our countries, right? It was a massive ramp-up in imports of these components. Now, it's not a coincidence. Obviously, what they're doing is they're building tons and tons of all antennas, and they're fielding them, they're forwarding to the Russian armed forces. These components are flowing from our countries, and they're going into the all antennas, which are flying over the battlefield. They're used to target, they're used to essentially bring artillery fire down onto Ukrainian formations. So, it's a pretty shocking finding, but that's in the reality of what's happening. Now, who builds this piece of kit? Who's responsible for building it? Gary, do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. So in terms of who the main people behind STC are primarily two individuals named Tarek and Terentiev, who are actually military scientists as well, who are both employed, as well as being part of STC, but also employed by the Budyonny military institution as well, which is specific for training Russians Signals Corps. They're also been listed as honoured inventors of the Russian Federation, which is an award bestowed on by the Russian president himself on a number of sort of key, scientific individuals, such as these two. And but the interesting thing that we actually managed to get hold of here, though, with regards to try to tie them to this company, which we believe is a front company for STC to procure these microelectronics, is the fact that we got the tax registration forms that were filed for the company back in 2017, which actually listed both of these individuals as founding members of the company. Now, the funny thing is that if you go to those records now, that you wouldn't actually see these names on them, though. So somehow they've managed to scrub their names from any more recent sort of tax register records, but we managed to get hold of some of the sort of earlier ones, and we can see that they were very critical in terms of setting up this company.
So that's it, right? So this is just one case study in the wider picture. But these are how a lot of the military supply chains work, right? They set up front companies. The Russian armed forces act through those front companies, and our suppliers in a range of our countries are ultimately forwarding goods to them through Hong Kong, through Turkey, through a range of those places. It hasn't been that difficult for them to set this up, as you can see in terms of how those exports, the volume of exports were moving. We have the Russian build-up on the Ukrainian border, and obviously they start to get a load of orders, and then they start importing all of this stuff, putting it into the Orlan 10s, and then producing them and sending them to the front. Now, that's really what we wanted to highlight with this piece. It's a case study, but it reflects just the wider picture, right? It reflects the wider picture. We think there have been, definite successes in slowing these exports down. There have been a range of people that have been indicted. There are a range of people that have been sanctioned, have been pursued by the authorities, and that definitely has slowed down a number of these networks. In this case, what we found is a very interesting one. We'll give you an example of how this works. It was actually happening in the US as well. Right, so these people need a range of US components. The US is a large manufacturer of these components. Well, what we found, in fact, was that one of the people who was shipping this stuff from the US was a dual Russian-US national, a gentleman called Igor Kazdan. He used an alias, and he ran a number of companies in the US. And what he was doing, he was procuring this stuff. He was essentially taking it to his address. He was essentially changing the labels, and he was shipping it to the Russians, to the front company for the manufacturer of the Orlan 10. He was essentially arrested, and he was indicted. But that is how this game is operating. And as Jack said, we talk a lot about the companies doing it, but ultimately it's a story about people. It's people that are doing this. And we spent a lot of time, essentially designating, listing companies, whether it's in the UK, whether it's the EU, whether it's the US. But ultimately, it's people that are doing this, and the story sometimes is relatively simple, and the supply chain is relatively simple, and that's something that we see reflected across a range of different cases, and something that we want to essentially help change. Right? We want to highlight this so that ultimately it's something that changes. We have a bit of time to talk through some of the other stuff, I think.
We do. I'm going to say this. We are at 25 minutes to go.
Okay.
I'm going to give you 5.
5. Okay.
And then I'm going to hold back my questions more or less for y'all's questions, okay?
We'll do this one really quickly because this is an interesting one. We've been very lucky as well in terms of what we've seen in Ukraine. Jack very recently, it was in October, November, saw some of the recent Iranian UAVs as well. Now, the story about the Iranian UAVs, I think Jack can explain it better than me, but, it's the same story. It's the same things. We find exactly the same components in them, exactly the same bits of technology, and very likely, they're using the same methods. But why don't you talk a little bit about it, Jack, because I think it's an interesting story.
I'd go beyond saying the same methods, which is that when the Russians started talking about how to sanctions-proof themselves in April, the Russian officials in the Ministry of Defense who were to design and run these procurement networks explicitly decided that they would model their efforts on the Iranian ones. And since they are now drawing on weapon systems that are made in Iran, that is a relationship that is going to expand. It's also going to give a lot more horsepower and capacity and resource to the IRGC. The interesting thing about this is that Shaheeds and their previous variants of Iranian drones, I've also examined used in Yemen, and they were much more crudely made. But they still used a lot of the same technologies. Now what we're seeing is a massive expansion of their production. And here, what the Russians are able to do is get a long-range, very, very precise weapon system with about 40 kilograms of payload, which is a lot of high explosive. And they can hit with pinpoint accuracy pretty much whatever they want across Ukraine with it. They have to fire a lot of them because they are slow-moving and you can shoot them down, but they're fundamentally cheap. They're about 40 grand each. And so they are a lot cheaper than the most of the systems that you would use to intercept them. And even if they all get shot down, what they tend to do is either saturate or prove the routes through the air defenses for Russian cruise missiles. And when they're used in conjunction with cruise missiles, they are the linchpin, really, of the attritional war the Russians are fighting in destroying critical national infrastructure across Ukraine. But if it was us on the receiving end, these things would be going after our air bases, our fuel dumps, and would pose a really, really serious threat to a lot of the capabilities that we rely on to give us advantage, which means that we don't just need to get after this to help the Ukrainians. It's also a security issue for ourselves in terms of deterrence.
Thank you.
All right. Less than 5.
Less than 5. Okay, we did it. Well, there we go.
Well done. So I'm going to hold back my question, because my question that I would have led with was, what do we need to target to most helpfully degrade the capabilities that Russia is using? And by talking to us about the Orlan and the Shahid, that suggests that those are two of the capabilities that you would most see as important to sort of starve the Russians of the capacity to utilize. I'll leave that thought in mind while I take a couple of questions. For our online listeners and participants, you too can ask questions. I've already got one. You can send it to gep@wilsoncenter.org if you're using email, if you're tweeting, @WilsonCenterGEP, okay? And with that, don't worry, I'll repeat it later. I'm going to take a couple questions from the floor. So let me go here.
Thank you. I'm Richard Cronin from the Stimson Center, and this is a fascinating topic. And during the COVID lockdown, I took a deep dive into semiconductors and have written a paper on this issue. But I'm shocked that you've not mentioned the word Taiwan in your presentation, because when you talk about U.S. sourced, say, chips, maybe in the older Russian weapon systems they have some Intel chips, for instance, but now all of our chips are made in Taiwan. And so my focus was on China, and that's a similar but much bigger issue, because and your focus on the sourcing is fascinating. I think it's a big issue to deal with China because of our extensive export controls on China as well. Thank you.
Yeah,
I actually thought of that,
Yeah.
the question of whether or not Russia would be looking to China as an alternative source if we were able to do this. But I toss it out to you.
Yeah, I will say a few things on that. We spent a few days here, and some of the presentations we've given was a lot longer and a lot more detailed. I think you're right. I think if you look at the stuff, a lot of the stuff that's been happening in the last few months and in the run-up is just a huge volume of stuff moving actually through China and through Hong Kong. A lot of that kit, nowadays, some of it moves through places like that, originating in fabrication labs in Malaysia or in Taiwan. I think Taiwan is also, there's other reasons why Taiwan is an issue here. There's a range of other reasons why Taiwan is a significant issue. I think, if we look at the Orlan 10, what we were talking about there, a lot of that stuff actually comes from our countries originally, though. A lot of it's actually moved from places like the US or sometimes from Holland or from Germany. That's where it's being routed through. Hong Kong is a big issue now. It's become an increasingly big issue on those supply chains in the last few months. One issue to focus on these is because obviously we have a lot more leverage here, right? If it's UK companies, that's something that we have a lot more leverage over immediately, rather than the Taiwan issue. If we're talking about oscillators or other kit that was found in Russian weapons platforms, I think after Jack first published that, there was an inquiry launched immediately in the UK, by a parliamentary inquiry into it. But I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Very, very, very briefly, I'd just highlight, we are observing that Chinese entities that are under sanction from the US are reaching out to the Russians and saying, we think we can provide alternative chips to some of the ones that you think you need, which the Russians are interested in. However, firstly, the Russians don't fully trust the Chinese, and they actually don't like always integrating Chinese components into their systems. Secondly, the Russians have also made assessments of what the Chinese are offering, and in many cases have concluded that what they produce is not going to meet the requirement and can't fulfill the role, and that they actually do need some of these Western-made components. unless they're going to completely redesign the system. And so over time, that may change. But at the moment, there are actually chips that the US is manufacturing that are used in all of these systems that there isn't a easy replacement for on the market from other providers.
And not a domestic Russian capability to manufacture.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, but you're right, and I think that's really something that we also need to think about.
Being manufactured here.
Yeah, there's fabrication. Yeah, exactly. Like there's lots of places, but ultimately, a lot of those companies, a lot of the companies are headquartered in our countries, right? And it's a lot of those companies which have obviously some due diligence obligations. But yes, you are right.
So I'm going to take an online question, and then don't worry, Michael, I'm coming to you next, all right? So one of our online listeners has asked whether you feel that the systems for export controls are somehow not really up to scratch, and then had a follow-on question about U.S. policy, and that was if the U.S. is moving to a more strategic long-term approach to export controls, i.e. looking at preventing the capability of development rather than just reacting to a crisis, is there an appetite or capability by other countries to do the same? And I will toss those two questions out there for you.
Let me take the first one, and then I can pass it over. I think it's definitely it's an important question. If this now is going to be a sort of central pillar of our policy, export controls, sanctions, real critical look at this technology, then are we resourced? Are our agencies resourced enough to do it? I think that's definitely been an issue, at least in the UK. I'm sure it probably is in the US as well. Are we using legacy systems to try and track this stuff? How is the analysis working, day to day on the ground? How are the analysts doing this? Do they have the right tools to do it? I think there are immediate answers to some of these problems, and it's also some of the work that we've been trying to do, right? So we've been trying to essentially take really big data sets down, trying to analyze these in clever ways. We've been using a range of tools and platforms provided by some of our partners, some of whom are here in the room today. For example, at the start of both our reports, we mentioned in partnership with a company called Altana, who essentially stitched together trade records using AI. There's a lot of things like this now, which are really critical to doing this work, right? They're really critical to doing this work successfully and at pace. And I think that's something that we all really need to sort of look at and reflect on. If this is going to be, a central pillar of our policy, does it also make sense, to not prioritize this when we're also supplying the Ukrainians with very, very large volumes of our equipment, right? Which obviously, we very much support that at RUSI, and I'm sure we all do. But we should also take a very critical look at the supply chains and how we track the things going into Russia and see where is it that we can have an impact on this. How can our agencies be improved to do this stuff? I think there's a really long discussion to be had about that. But I don't know, Jack or Gary, do you have thoughts?
Very briefly, I'd just say that export control is very reactive at the moment. And what we are in here is an adversary who is proactively working their way around the gaps, and they can do it at scale and they're resourced to do that. And so we need to shift mindset into a much more proactive enforcement approach where we are actively going and not just we found evidence that this company is, therefore now it gets added to lists and maybe we'll react if that list crops up. But instead, this person wants to buy some chips from me for a company that only just started existing a month ago, has no history in the market in this place, and by the way, the owner's Russian. Maybe I should go and check before I release sale as to whether or not this is a legitimate purchase or whether it's for something nefarious. And maybe the IC has the information to release that. Those sorts of mechanisms are things that we did get good at when we were thinking about counterterrorism. But we need to think about that in terms of hostile counter-state, which is where we're at with this. So I think being much more proactive, and also if you think about some of the mechanisms we built during the war on terror for sharing information between countries really rapidly and legal mechanisms to do that, that doesn't really exist within the export control space. What we see time and time again is that a shipment will go to, I'm just going to pick on a country at random, but Germany. And even though the information that a shipment is going somewhere it shouldn't is identified, the Germans can't move it because of their own internal processes between their different agencies fast enough to catch it before it leaves the Schengen area or leaves German jurisdiction. And so it still gets to Russia. And then the company's collapsed and a new one's set up. You start at square one. So that requires us seeing this in a multinational light. And that's a change in mindset and a change in permissions and policies.
And I'll add one small thing on that as well, which is, we've seen this with our work across a range of different spaces like North Korea. But one of the keys to doing this work is the open source aspect of it, right? It's open source data. It's customs records that we've bought. It's company records that we've bought. It's the fusing together of all of these open source data sets, married with obviously, a really interesting data set that we've collected in Ukraine. But the open source nature of that work allows you to share it immediately to partners, right? And so we've done this with a range of governments. We've already, with this stuff, we've produced sort of intelligence products. We've shared it with people, and that it can move very quickly. And I think that's historically been one of the issues with these kind of things: is if it comes from classified sources, it sits there and nothing happens. And I think so sort of the adoption of these kind of techniques and this kind of data is actually something that governments should look at. I think a lot are increasingly looking at doing that, but it just speeds up the process, and I think that's definitely something that can help policy on this.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And I'm going to come to the question down here. Thank you. And please, of course, everybody
Yep.
identify yourself beforehand.
Vagar Maradigan from Defense and Aerospace Report. Lovely seeing you. Tremendous work, Jack. Good to see you. I want to follow up, James, on your point, right? The OSINT community by intelligence services has been looked at either with some disdain by national intelligence services, if not the tinfoil hat crowd, unfortunately. Whereas time and again, you're demonstrating that you guys are actually revealing things more quickly even than established intelligence and law enforcement. What does the nature of cooperation need to be? What does the nature of the cooperation need to be between the OSINT community and among the intelligence communities and law enforcement? Because what you guys are illustrating here is firsthand stuff, and then we just ruminate over it for months as opposed to generating actionable, rapid changes to what Jack said, right? You're now interdicting the production of 18 missiles that's going to kill people and change the warfighting dynamic.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I think things are slowly changing. I think sort of range of governments and agencies are seeing the value in this stuff, and we've been doing it for several years, really. This kind of work, and in fact, I mean, the person who helped us set this up was a former British government official that used to work in interdictions for the government, right? And he was like, the problem with interdictions was that we could never do it because all the information was classified. So we couldn't share it with the French. We couldn't share it with the Germans. So why don't we think about setting a parallel system up with just open sources? And I think that is, I think it was a great insight. I think it works. And I think, we have a range of government partners already. We work with a range of different institutions. We're visiting Brussels next week, actually, and talking about exactly this kind of stuff. But so I think it is changing. I think people have seen the value of if we can. So sometimes with our North Korea work, we can collect a satellite image in the morning. We task a satellite, we collect the image, we process it. 3 hours later, it's for the customer, and it can be shared. It can go to anybody. It can go to the Japanese government. It can go to the South Korean government. The vessel can be interdicted. And that's the beauty of this stuff. And I think that can be moved immediately to this problem set because there's so much data out there. It's just a question of fusing it and doing the analysis and turning the product out in a speedy, timely way. I think there's so much value to this, and it's not just us. There's loads of people doing this, right? There's loads. Like if you look at Bellingcat, they've just did incredible work with the open sources. There's a range of other people doing it, but hopefully it does change.
To give a really theoretical but practical example of, I think, how this relationship needs to work. If you imagine, I was running this in Russia and I spoke to one of my subordinates and said, I need you to go here and set up this company and I'm going to move this money into this account and then you can go and purchase X, Y, and Z. Follow these instructions. If that was attacked purely as an OSINT problem, the only point at which you would know about it and have the evidence to push around is after that person had actually purchased the goods, it showed up in trade data, etc., which would be a couple of months later, and it's published and you can purchase it on some registry. And so that's nice, you can be the person who says, we know what you did, but fundamentally the chip still got through, right? So that's a failure. Now, if through covert collection, I pick up on that original conversation and I go round the OSINTers and say, hey, there's this guy, you should probably keep an eye on him. And so there's already the indicators in place. Then the second that person registers a company, the OSINTers have it. And that is then open source information which can be shared, and there's no you don't need to reveal that there was some classified collection that cued you on. But it means that in the ocean of open source information, you can really rapidly build data sets that you can share. And all of a sudden, the second that person tries to buy something, then that can be, the indicators and warnings come on, and the person can be blown before they succeed. And so I think there is a relationship and a handover that needs to happen if we're talking about how this works inside government. Obviously, that can't work with an institution like RUSI because we're not part of government, not part of the community. But that requires different bits of the interagency to talk to each other and to kind of exploit those different tools so that they can do this at pace and do it at scale and exploit the AI capabilities that James was referring to.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
And it does require robust interagency action, and I could imagine that for some countries it's also then a question of building a robust interagency capability, because that is not always the case, even in some of our closest partners. Michael, I promised you a question.
Okay. Thank you very much. As a U.S. government person who once carried out export control investigations, I found this very interesting, and I agree that oftentimes you're playing catch up. My name's Michael Keyes from the Kennan Institute. I guess my question is as fascinating as this is, how much in the full sort of panoply of Russian weapon systems being used in Ukraine, right, is this really touching on? How many of these things are in that whole set of weapons are sophisticated, in which case this touches on this, and how much is this stuff completely made in Russia, doesn't require things from abroad, and is actually very simple and can be mass-produced and thrown in large numbers at the Ukrainians?
Any Russian weapon system which requires any sort of complex processing that needs to know where it is, know where the target is, detect or sense something, and then process that detection and sensing is going to use critical components made in the West. Anything. All of their SIGINT, electronic warfare, air defense radars, etc., right? So if you talk to the US Air Force, what scares them about the Russian military? It's the integrated air and missile defense system, which is horrendous. The most effective use of it we've seen in Ukraine is a Ukrainian jet shot down at 15 feet at 160 kilometers, right? So you start looking at what that means is against NATO capability, and okay, we've got different options, but it's still a problem. All of those prestige weapon systems, Western components are in the missiles, in the radar, in the ability to fuse the radar picture to actually offer guidance to the missile, and in the communication. And even when we're talking about dumb systems like 152 millimeter impact fuse shells, okay, fine, they can do that domestically, but either they're going to fire so many of them at you in order to hit a target that you can just destroy the ammunition dump before the ammo even gets to the front, in which case you don't need to worry, or they're going to need to get some sort of precise lock, whether that's with GPS or another system on where the target is, and then cue on the fires accurately through, let's say, Grot or through one of their Akatsiya fire control systems or whatever it is. All of those precision systems that enable their dumb and simple stuff to be militarily effective on a modern battlefield is dependent on critical Western components. So no, this is everything. And it doesn't matter if you go into one of their modernized T-90s, T-90M, or T-72B3 tanks. In and of itself, not a huge problem, but if you put modern thermal optics on it, then it becomes competitive with a lot of Western platforms. Where are the thermal optics made? Usually France. So this is a systemic issue, and just to be completely upfront, we haven't looked inside of huge numbers of Chinese or North Korean systems, but I am going to nail my colors to the mast and say it's exactly the same. Yeah.
And we focused on also, it's worth remembering, this story that we told is semiconductors and microelectronics, but it's not just that. It's all sorts of other things as well. one of the really interesting things was like sophisticated hydraulic suspension for a range of like Russian vehicles, right? So, manufactured by a company in Europe, right? But there's lots of other things like that, and I mean, so it's not just this microelectronic issue; it's a wider systemic issue, I think.
If you had to guess, what would you think that the Russians are doing now to try to enhance their ability to evade and to continue to procure this? Because they must be falling woefully behind in terms of having replacement parts.
Yeah. So we kind of know what they're doing, right? We did a piece with Reuters recently. It was released at the end of December. But there's some really funny stories in that. You can see companies spring up in Russia, and then one day they've been created. 2 months later, they're importing $200 million of Western components, right? Just from nothing, right? Where is that company addressed to? It's a little house in the middle of a forest. I mean, and it's importing $200 million worth of components. We see that story just again and again, right? And so that's what they're doing. They create new companies, and then they move it through a range of different places. We have seen the displacement of trade. We've seen, and if you read some of those pieces, you've seen it. It goes through a range of countries. Turkey, right? So the EU sanctions came in. People shut down shop in Germany. They couldn't move it anymore. So they started moving it from Germany to Turkey, and then Turkey on to Russia. So we've seen a lot of that. Obviously, they still have a range of these networks which are active in our countries. We've seen a number of people recently, if you follow the news closely, across various countries in Europe, there have been arrests, and there are ongoing cases. What do these people find when they look, when they're charged? Well, they're doing exactly this kind of stuff, moving technology. So that's what they're doing. I don't know, Jack, if you have a...
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there is a systematic influence campaign to discourage countries from joining the sanctions architecture, and that is partly because they want to create friction between us and countries that we want to do business with, but are also quite happy to overlook things continuing onto Russia, Turkey being the very good example, but there are plenty of others. And then the other aspect of this is they've changed their procurement process in terms of being prepared to pay over the odds, which allows them to get unwilling people to suddenly become quite willing to help, and also to procure massive quantities up front. So rather than the way it used to work, which was they had these fairly consistent flows, now it's set up a company, buy as many as you can through that company in a shorter space of time, and then as soon as the authorities get wind of it, collapse the company and start again. So they're going for bulk at a time, recognizing that these are going to be small windows of opportunity with any given channel. And that's something that the Iranians do too, right? If you look at when the Iranians choose to use German engines in their UAVs, it's usually because it's a higher profile mission where they want reliability. But they know that the second those UAVs hit their targets, German engines, there are various mechanisms by which you can trace where they come from and which company bought them. That's not the same for other manufacturers. And so the IRGC knows that it will lose that procurement network once it uses that capability. And that shapes how they choose to employ their systems, which is another really important point. If you're vigilant, then you can constrain their operations just because of the cost of them using certain pieces of kit. And that's a worthy goal, even if you're not stopping everything.
Just one other point I want to add on that as well. Like in terms of the examples that James was talking about with the like say for example the companies in Germany stop shipping to Russia and then potentially like ships to Turkey instead to then transship it. I mean, I just want to talk about in terms of the OSINT capabilities. For example, looking at trade data is very important when it came to this. Like so, in examples he gave there that Reuters also looked into is that it's using trade data to try to identify companies that are suddenly shipping like a lot of stuff to Russia all of a sudden, or are importing all of a lot, and you look into it and it's like, well, they've only just been set up. I mean, it's very critical to sort of like for targeting with regards to that for future investigations. I mean, the great one about that James mentioned there with this German company that had been shipping to Russia directly, it stopped its shipments in February. Well, we looked in terms of who the actual importer was, and the importer then suddenly got a large influx of components all of a sudden from a company in Turkey. You look into the Turkish registry and it's the same person who owned that company in Germany. that had just set it the month later on, and that's in order to circumvent sanctions.
Often the same name of company as well.
Yeah.
Just a different jurisdiction.
Lack of imagination.
Yeah.
I really want to thank all of you for presenting this story in such a compelling way. I want to thank our audience for their very good questions and engagement and for turning out here today. So, James, Gary, Jack, thank you very much indeed. We have appreciated this, and for everyone, please do have a look at this thriller of a report that it is online at RUSI's website. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Thank you.